We all make plans. Hey, some of us, and you might be able to relate to this, some of us think of ourselves as planners. You write down everything on the calendar. You prepare several months, even years in advance. You try to have your whole life planned out before you. Some of us wouldn't think of ourselves as planners. You're more the go-with-the-flow type. You take a day at a time. But even in this, even in things that we might think of as simple or normal, we plan them out. Okay, a hangout with friends, what we'll do at work that day, how we'll spend our evening after work or after the day is finished. We all make plans. We all consider the future and prepare for it in some sense. Some of us may do it more often. Some of us may do it more detailed or far out. But either way, each and every one of us in this room, I would even say children do, we plan out our lives, or we plan out a couple hours ahead. And we have a passage this morning that addresses planning. The subject of thinking and preparing for the future is before us this morning, and our text is, as Judah read for us, James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, and I'd encourage you, if you didn't have it open already, to keep your Bible open as we'll be working our way through this text, James 4, 13 through 17, and the theme of this text is this. James doesn't say we shouldn't plan, but he shows the proper way to plan. James doesn't say we shouldn't plan, but he shows the proper way to plan. So James begins by addressing someone making plans. If you look with me at the start of our passage, I'll read again for us James 4:13. James addresses someone making plans. He says this at the start of our passage. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. So here in verse 13, James is referring to, or he's using the picture of a businessman. Okay, I think he's speaking to the business men of the congregation or of the Christians that he is writing to. He's addressing a specific scenario of businessmen. He's talking about the rich, which in next week's passage, we'll be addressing that passage at the beginning of chapter 5 that addresses the rich. But I believe he's in connection with that passage, referring to a businessman with this example, but I don't think this passage is only applied to businessmen, to people that own their own companies or businesses. But I believe this text and in this verse specifically, it relates to each of us. When it comes to our preparation, we can put ourselves into this scenario. Maybe we have to tweak it a little bit. But in whatever stage in life you are, we make plans. We do what verse 13 says at times. Okay, it relates to mom and dads making plans for their children. It relates to the high school student that's thinking about the future, thinking about life after high school and planning it out. It relates to you if you own a business, or maybe you're a boss and you're mapping out your business or your company for the next 10 years. It relates to the church committee, planning activities or service projects for the year. It relates to you as you think about just what you'll do next weekend. It relates to the person anticipating retirement, when they will retire and what they'll do in that retirement. It relates to the board of elders as we consider the direction of this church. It relates to teens and what sports they'll play for the upcoming seasons and how well they'll do in that sport. We can apply this passage to what we plan, what we schedule, what we anticipate for the future. And just like the businessman in this scenario says, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, we sometimes include the very specifics or these details that he does. Okay, as we plan, we might speak of the time, the place, the duration, the activity, and the result. Okay, the high school student might say, when I graduate, I will begin college and go to this specific college and graduate in 4 years for this profession, and then I'll get a job right out of college in this field. The person anticipating retirement may say, in 5 years I will retire and I'll have this much money, these benefits, I'll get a part-time job, and I'll travel some. You may plan out your night ahead saying you'll go to dinner at 5 o'clock, then at 6:30 you'll go for ice cream, and then at 7 o'clock you'll end your night with a movie. You too may include some, if not all, of the factors that this this person planning in verse 13 does, of when and where, how long, what you'll be doing, what the result will be when you plan. And here in verse 13, as we think about it, James is addressing a specific way of planning. He's addressing a specific type of planning. And even though I think we can relate, I won't accuse all of us of being in this category of planning. But as we work our way through this message, I'll let you decide if you plan as verse 13 gives us the example of. And for now, you might look at verse 13, and even I'd encourage you to do so, and ask what's wrong with this type of planning. As you see how he lays out his life, what's wrong with this type of planning that we find in verse 13? We'll find out soon, but first, James brings out two realities concerning life in the next verse. In verse 14, we get two realities concerning life, and the first of those realities concerning life that James shows is that life is unpredictable. Life is unpredictable. Look with me at verse 13 again, and it flows right into verse 14, so I'll read verses 13 and 14 for us. It says, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit.' And then this is what verse 14 says, 'Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring.'" Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. James is saying you plan out the future, but you don't know the future. We can say with no certainty what will happen next. Just think about all the times that you plan something and it's interrupted, or you plan something and it doesn't happen. What you think will happen doesn't end up taking place. So James speaks here of the reality that we may plan, we may schedule out the future detailed and with great planning. We may say, I'll do this on this day and I'll do that on that day. But these plans are what they are. Plans. Simply plans. Not perfect portrayals of the future. Okay, we know this truth that life is unpredictable all too well when it comes to the winter. Okay, either it's with snow, we make plans, we plan to go to school the next day, we're planning an event, and it snows that day, and what you were planning to do is either canceled or it's postponed. You made plans, but they don't happen. Also in the winter, we often get sick. And what you intended on doing can't happen because you're lying in bed for that day. It is something that occurs often. Our plans are interrupted. Our plans don't come into fruition. And as you think about your life, you may have story upon story that illustrates this exact point that James is bringing out. I'll give you one illustration from my life. As I think back to high school, I had big plans for the spring of my junior year. I had lofty goals for my track and field season that spring. I had times I planned to hit. I had relay races that I was sure I would be on. I even was thinking past that junior year and thinking concerning college, of what college I would go to if they didn't have a track and field program. And then I hurt my back. I could barely stand up straight or walk normally, so of course that track and field season I couldn't run. I tried, but I ended up getting shut down for that track season. Things didn't go as planned. That spring looked a lot different than I had envisioned. The future was not as I fully intended it to be. I didn't see a back injury coming, but it did, and it changed that spring and really the rest of the plans for my college years. As I said, we all have stories in this room of how life is unpredictable. You didn't know what the next day or the next month or the next year would hold. We can mark our calendars, we can come up with detailed schedules, but in reality, we don't know. We don't know, and neither can we control what happens tomorrow, and for that matter, the next minute. We don't even know what will happen the next minute. Life is unpredictable is the first reality that James reminds them of as they make these plans. But there's another, okay? The second statement concerning the reality of life begins with the question, if you look there in verse 14, it begins with the question, what is your life? What is your life? Meaning, James is saying, how should your life be defined? Okay, if you could give your life just one word, if you could describe it or label it with just one word, what would that word be? And I would imagine it is not the word that James gives in the next part, or the next statement that he gives. And that brings us to the second reality James brings out, is that life itself is uncertain and further short-lived. Life itself is uncertain and further short-lived. Look with me again at verse 13. He says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." So that one word James gives is the word mist. What is your life? For you are a mist. This word mist might be better translated smoke. Okay, a smoky vapor is what this word literally means in the Greek. James is giving us one of his word pictures, comparing it to life, that life is like smoke. It's there 1 second and gone the next. Okay, we're approaching summer, and as I announced in the beginning of our service, our campfire service is coming up. Lord willing, we'll have a campfire at that service. Maybe you'll attend several campfires this upcoming summer. But when we think about smoke around a campfire, probably the first thing that comes to mind is it's annoying. Okay, we think of it as annoying as it follows us around as we try to roast or sit around the campfire. It seems to follow us wherever we go and burns our eyes. But another thing, as you think about this smoke that may come to mind, is it's extremely temporary. Okay, it's momentary. It passes us by quickly. It passes us and it's replaced by more smoke. And this is the point that James is making concerning this mist or this smoky vapor compared to life. As he continues on, he says, "What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time." Our lives pass us by quickly. They are short-lived, brief in the grand scheme of things. Our lives appear for a little time. As a child, okay, maybe the children can relate to this, but the adults can. As you think back to your childhood, most likely, as a child, life felt slow. As a child, it feels like you have your whole life ahead of you. Even as a child, not having as much going on, the summers, not being in school, can feel like the summer is just dragging on as you sit at home. But as a child, life feels slow, and even as a young adult. If you're a young adult here this morning, you may have just graduated from college, you're beginning a career, buying a house, getting married, having kids. Life is just beginning in some ways. It seems like you have a long life ahead of you. But just talk to someone who has lived a long life or has lived many years beyond you, and they will tell you it goes by in a flash. It goes by in a flash. It goes by quick. And the point James could be making here with this point is that they are planning as if there is no end in sight. They are planning and preparing for the future with no thought of the end, as if their lives are just going on and on and on. James points out that their life will come to an end, and it may come sooner than they think. And that leads into the other aspect about life and living that I believe is here, and that is the fact that life itself is uncertain. Okay, just as events in life are unpredictable, they're uncertain, so too it is unpredictable exactly when you will die. Look with me again at verse 14. James says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." Vanishes. The word is meant to communicate disappears, gone suddenly. James is making the point that living is not even a definite. You might be alive today and gone tomorrow. We do not have control of future events or situations or circumstances, and neither do we have control of how long we live. In the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, the second verse of the book says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And then at the end of the book, so it starts this way, and then towards the back of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 8, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. All is vanity. Over 30 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, this word vanity is used, and it's very similar to the word and the idea found here in James for mist. And I believe James very well, we can't know for sure, but I think he might very well be referring back to the book of Ecclesiastes in verse 14, as James has many similarities with the wisdom literature of the Bible. But this word vanity in Ecclesiastes literally means vapor or breath. It gives us this same picture that James is creating with the word mist of smoke, communicating the idea that as we think about our lives, we are here for a moment. Our lives are not long-lasting. Gone before we know it. We have no control over life itself. So as we think about the flow of our passage, what we've seen in these two verses, James has spoken of their planning. They make plans, and yet they don't know what the future holds, both in specific events and even if they're going to continue on living. The future concerning these things is a big question mark. We now move on to verse 15. Okay, and we find James gives the proper approach to life and planning. So we come to the proper approach to life and planning. Look with me at verse 15. James 4:15 says, "Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." So here in verse 15, James is showing the correct way to plan. He spoke of how they made plans in verse 13, and now he says, instead, you ought to say. He's saying, you plan that way, this is actually how you should plan. That is what you say. Here in verse 15, he's saying, this is what you should say. He's shown how they think about the future, and now he's telling them how they should think about the future. So what's the difference between verse 13 and verse 15? Look with me again in verse 13. Just pay careful attention, and maybe even, I'll put it this way, think about what's left out. Verse 13, look with me there. "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit." And then skip over verse 14 and look at verse 15. He says, "Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." In verse 13, how they usually plan, they have left God out. They have left God out. Their plans were made with no consideration of God. More specifically, their plans were made with no consideration of what God has planned, what God desires for the future, what God has ordained to take place in their lives. No mention of it in verse 13, and I believe James is not only speaking of what they vocalize here, of what they say, but he's also referring to what they think, the plans in their minds. Now let's think about this approach that James commands of them. If the Lord wills. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. When it says, if the Lord wills, James is saying, if the Lord desires for something to take place. But it's more strong. It's not just God is wishing, God is hoping, but the Lord has the ability to make it happen. So James is more strongly saying, by saying, if the Lord wills, he's saying, if the Lord has purposed something to happen, if the Lord has firmly decided for this to take place. So what approach is James instructing them to have as they plan and as they consider the future? First, I'd say it's a realization and it's a belief they must have as they make their plans. What James instructs of them, if the Lord wills, we will live or do this or that. It's a realization that God is in control of the future. It's believing God directs all events and situations. It's his purposes and it's his plans that ultimately will be fulfilled. It's acknowledging the fact that God stands behind everything that takes place in this world. Nothing happens that is not under his oversight and control. It's not fate, it's not luck, it's not chance, it's not fortune, but as we think about the future, we fully acknowledge that it is God who has power over all that goes on. So as you think about making that schedule, as we think about what we will do months from now, we must have this realization and this belief that God controls the future. Second, as we think about this phrase or this type of planning, if the Lord wills, it's a submission to that will. It's a submission to that will. So it's a realization, it's a belief, but it's also a submission. Not just knowing God directs the future, but being submissive to that direction or that future that he has directed. As you think about what your family will do this year, as you project out for your company, as you plan out the week, it's saying and thinking, these are just my plans. These may not be God's. This is just what I'd love to see take place. But it's only God who knows and controls the future. Having this submissive attitude or mindset, it's saying, God, if this is not what happens, I'm good with that. I'll accept that. I'll be okay with that. It's a humble posture to what God has decided and a willingness to bow to it when we make our plans. When we plan, it's easy to think, this is what needs to happen. If this doesn't happen, then everything is going to be a disaster. It can't be any other way. And if we do this, if we think this way, then this planning is not in submission to God's plans. This is not humbly bowing to whatever God would have in store for us, even if it's not what we have planned. So again, as you think about that schedule, as you think about preparing for the hours, the days, the months, the years ahead, do so in submission to God's will, not your own. God's plans, not your own plans. It's the second thing we see here with this planning, with this phrase, if the Lord wills. Third, to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. It's a trust. It's a trust. To trust in the will of God and what he would have for the future. If it is or isn't what you would desire and have laid out to happen. It's a trust that God knows best. It's a dependence and a reliance on his will, not our own. It's a trust that God is all wise and knowing that we are not when we make our plans. When we plan, we can easily only trust in our wisdom, what we can see with our eyes, or what we can project out, or what we've thought through, thinking that we have come up with the absolute best plan for our lives and for the way forward. We can feel as if when we plan, it's foolproof. Okay, it's going to happen. Nothing else would be better. This is not doing what James says here. If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. So as you plan, it needs to be trusting in God's will, that he knows what is best. He sees the whole picture. He knows all things and perfectly plans out the future. And then the fourth and the last thing as we consider verse 15 in this way of planning, I'd say it's a mindset. It's a mindset, which kind of encompasses all of the three things we've just seen. That it's a realization and a belief, it's a submission, it's a trust, and this is ultimately a mindset that you're to have. Some take verse 15 and they really tear down the notion of using these words, if the Lord wills. They say that though James says we're to say this, he really wants this to be a mindset. They would almost be against saying, if the Lord wills or Lord willing. And as we think about this, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, if the Lord wills, Lord willing, just so your mindset, just so your thinking is truly thinking in living by this principle, that it is if the Lord wills. If the Lord is so ordained, this will take place. So what James gives them as they plan is not just words, certainly can be words, but it ultimately boils down to this mindset, this way of thinking. It may not be spoken, but it's in your thoughts as you plan. Or as you fill out your calendar, it's coursing through your mind. Or as you plan out the year as a church committee, you pray to the Lord, offering up these things, saying, only if you so will. And as we think about this approach, I won't give us all of the examples, but the Apostle Paul exemplifies this approach, this way of planning very well. In the book of 1 Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 4:19, he says this, but I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I will find out the talk of these arrogant people, not the talk of these arrogant people, but their power. And then he goes on later on in the book in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 5 through 7, he says this as he talks about his plans. He says, I will visit you after passing through Macedonia. for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now just in passing. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. And the interesting thing is we find in 2 Corinthians that these plans that Paul had set out didn't actually happen. They didn't happen as Paul had planned, but he lives with this mindset. And he even uses the words, if the Lord wills, if the Lord permits. This must be how we approach the future. This must be how we prepare for the future. Now think back to the plans that were originally given in verse 13. Okay, plans that don't take God into account. And we might begin to think, okay, I really need to take God into consideration. I really need to take what God has determined into account, but isn't it pretty harmless to plan the way verse 13 has planned? What's the big deal with that type of planning? And that's where James goes next. James shows the sinful root of this planning. Look with me at James 4:16. So move on to the next verse. James 4:16 says this, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So here James speaks of what they are really doing in verse 9, or what is the root of such planning. And that is, you boast in your arrogance. He says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. James is saying you brag, you glory in, you take pride in your lofty views of yourself. James is saying that when you say, or when they say today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit without any thought of God, they're acting arrogantly. They have a high view of themselves, believing they can determine the future. They dictate their schedule. And I'd ask you, have you ever thought of your planning in such a way? When God's not in mind, when you're deciding what you will do and what will fill your schedule, and what your future holds, that it's you believing that you somehow have the ability to determine what will actually take place in your life. You have a high view of yourself in these instances. It's prideful. It's pride. And on the flip side, I don't think we usually think about pride in this way. We think of pride as when someone is bragging or showing off, but we find pride is also when we make plans that we feel must happen, that this is the best course of action, that this will happen. And look at what James says about this pride in your planning. Look at the end of verse 16. He says, all such boasting is evil. It's wicked. It's sin. So it's not harmless. Okay, this planning of verse 13 is not harmless. Plans without any consideration of God. It's not harmless to plan in this way. And realize these plans can be to do good, beneficial things. Okay, we're not talking about plans that are to do sinful things, but it's to do good, beneficial things. But it's sin because you're leaving out God, or you're leaving God out of the picture, acting as if you had the ability to determine what the future holds. You're placing yourself in the position of God when you plan this way. You're placing yourself in the position of God when you plan this way. You're putting yourself in God's seat. You're taking the pen of God's calendar and establish the future when you have no business and also no ability to do so. And we saw the same idea in our last study in James when it came to having a critical spirit. When you judge people based on non-biblical principles and rules that you've come up with, in so doing, we are taking the place of God in being the lawgiver, the writer of Scripture, and additionally, we're seeking to take God's place as the judge. And now we're doing the very same thing here as we think about and prepare for the future. We're seeking to take the place of the only one who can determine the future, God. Planning in this way is completely wrong. We shouldn't do it. Our passage closes then with a call to do as God is instructed when it comes to our planning. Look with me at verse 17. Look with me at James 4:17, how our passage rounds out. It says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. What we have here is a sin of omission. A sin of omission is something that we don't take action to commit, and yet it's sin. Sins of commission are something that we do take action to commit. So James has just instructed them concerning planning, how they should plan, the mindset that they should have going forward. And now he says, if you do not do as I've told, it's sin. It would be a sin of omission. You're ignoring what God has laid out for you to follow. God says, do this, and if you don't do it, it's sin. This is no take it or leave it command. This is something that must be done. We can't ignore it. We can't brush it off when it comes to our planning. So as we think about what James has said today, okay, what the Word of God has declared to us this morning, I'd ask you to think about if this is how you plan. If this is how you approach the future, and to help you do so, I'll ask you this question. Just think about this question for your own life. Are you frustrated when your plans do not come to fruition? Are you frustrated when your plans do not come to fruition? When what you've decided to do, what you've marked your calendar to take place, what you have been anticipating happening for weeks and weeks to come, and then it doesn't happen and doesn't go as planned, do you become upset? Are you out of sorts? Are you beyond sad? If this is the case, I don't know if you could say you're living by the principle that James lays out for us this morning. It sounds a whole lot more like you've submitted to and you've trusted in your own will. You're thinking through and planning for the future, not God's will. How we respond if our plans do not happen reveals to us if we're planning as James lays out in our passage. So I ask you this as we close this morning. Do you want to be a good planner? As you think about your life, do you want to be someone who's good at, maybe even wise as you come up with your schedule? Do you want to be a good planner? And I won't offer you 5 easy steps to become the world's greatest planner, but I will offer you just one. Just one step to become a good planner, and it's the step God's Word offers us this morning. And that step is that in planning, do so with the mindset that these plans will only take place if God so wills. Let's pray. Lord, you are the one who has the perfect plan. You are the one who ultimately is in control of our future. You not only know it, but you have planned it. You have purposed and ordained and directed all that would take place. It's in your hands. Lord, I pray that as your people, we would be people that would not only know this, but that we would submit to it and even trust in it, knowing that you are the God who has the whole picture in mind. You know all that will happen. You know the events of our life. You know the tragedies of our life. You know all that will take place. You know the interruptions that will come. And Lord, you have even planned them out. Lord, they are fully under your sovereign control. And Lord, as your people, I pray that as we think about the future, as we make our schedules, as we think about the next school year, or even as we think about this coming summer, as we think about the years of our life, Lord, I pray that we would be people that as we make our plans, as we come up with them, that we would have in our minds, that it would be something that we would hold on to and a principle that we would live by and think by, that this will only take place if you so will. Lord, I pray that we would be people that would often say and often think that this is only going to happen if the Lord so wills. Lord, help us to live by this truth in your word today. And in your name I pray. Amen.